the night Marisol's daughter stopped breathing. Her husband was 40 minutes away in a hotel room that cost $400 a night. That's the part that never leaves you. Not the grief itself. Grief you can name, you can hold, you can eventually learn to carry. It's the timing. It's knowing that while Marisol was in the emergency bay of St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, screaming her daughter's name at a nurse who kept saying, "Stay calm. Ma'am, please stay calm." Devereaux had his phone on silent, tucked under a pillow. Because he didn't want to be interrupted. Marisol had met Devereaux Crane at a faculty mixer at the University of Toronto when she was 26 and finishing her master's in social work. He was 31, already teaching contract law, wearing a blazer over a worn flannel shirt like he couldn't decide who he was yet. She thought that was charming. She thought a lot of things about him were charming that she later had to unlearn one by one, like pulling splinters from skin. They married when she was 28. Her father, Alistair, walked her down the aisle at a small church in Oakville and shook Devereaux's hand with the particular grip of a man who was watching closely. Alistair didn't say anything that day. He was a quiet man by nature, retired from 30 years in the RCMP, comfortable with silence, slow to speak and slower to forget. He smiled at the photos. He danced with Marisol to an old Joni Mitchell song she'd loved since childhood. He told her she looked beautiful and that he was proud of her. What he didn't say, not that day and not for a long time after, was that something about Devereaux Crane made the back of his neck feel cold. Marisol and Devereaux settled into a townhouse in the west end of the city. She took a position at a family services agency downtown. He kept teaching, published a paper or two, collected small academic honors the way other men collect watches. They were, by most outward measures, a couple that made sense. Dinner parties, a shared Netflix account, the occasional weekend drive up to Muskoka to look at the water. Their daughter, Piper, was born when Marisol was 31, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, born in the middle of a February snowstorm with Devereaux's hand in hers and Alistair pacing the waiting room in his old RCMP jacket because he'd driven 3 hours from Barrie the moment she called. Piper had Marisol's dark eyes and Devereaux's stubborn jaw and an allergy to tree nuts that they discovered when she was 14 months old after a bite of a granola bar sent them rushing to the ER the first time. After that, Marisol kept an EpiPen in every bag, in every jacket pocket, in the kitchen drawer, in the glove compartment of both cars. She knew the signs the way some parents know their child's favorite songs, instantly, in the body, without having to think. What Marisol didn't know, what she had no reason to know yet, was that for approximately 11 months before that February night, Devereaux had been sleeping with a colleague, a visiting lecturer named Courtney, 10 years younger, who taught a seminar on corporate ethics and apparently saw no contradiction in that. She found out later, in pieces, the way you always find out about these things. A name that appeared twice in his texts, a charge at a hotel bar on their joint credit card on a Thursday when he'd said he had a faculty senate meeting. Small things. The kind of thing you talk yourself out of noticing because the alternative explanation is too ugly to look at directly. But, on the night that mattered, Marisol didn't know any of this yet. On the night that mattered, she was putting Piper down for bed. It was a Tuesday in March, still cold, that particular gray dark that settles over Toronto in early spring when winter hasn't quite let go. Devereaux had texted at 6 to say he'd be home late, conference prep, don't wait up. She hadn't waited up. She'd given Piper a bath, read her 3 books, made herself a bowl of soup and gone to bed early. She was half asleep when she heard the sound. It was a sound she'd never heard Piper make before. A thin, strained sound, high and wrong. And Marisol was on her feet before she was fully awake, in that way that parenthood rewires the nervous system in ways you don't fully understand until you're living inside them. Piper was sitting up in her crib, face flushed, eyes wide and terrified. Her lips had the faint blue undertone that Marisol recognized from the hospital pamphlets she'd memorized 2 years earlier. Her breathing was the shallow, effortful pull of a body fighting to do something that should be automatic. Marisol grabbed the EpiPen from the top drawer of the change table, administered it, called 911, told them what was happening in short, clear sentences, the way her father had taught her to speak in an emergency. Facts, no extras, no emotion until after. She called Devereaux while she waited for the ambulance. Straight to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called a 3rd time and then she stopped calling him because the ambulance had arrived and Piper needed her entire body, every cell of attention she had. They worked on Piper in the ambulance on the way to St. Michael's. Marisol sat beside her daughter and held her hand and talked to her in a low, even voice, telling her she was okay, she was safe, Mama was right here. She believed it. She had to believe it. She called Devereaux from the waiting room at 11:14 p.m. She called him at 11:22. At 11:35, she texted, "It's Piper. Please call me now. It's serious." At 11:47, a doctor came through the doors with an expression that Marisol had seen on faces before. Had seen it at her mother's bedside at her uncle's funeral. And she knew what it meant before the woman opened her mouth. Piper was gone. Anaphylactic shock, severe, compounded by a brief but critical window without a second dose when the first EpiPen hadn't been enough. The paramedics had done everything they could. The team at St. Michael's had done everything they could. Sometimes the doctor said, and then said some other things that Marisol could hear but couldn't process, because the room had gone very quiet and very far away. Devereaux called back at 12:03 a.m. He sounded groggy, a little irritated. He said he'd had his phone on silent, he'd been in the middle of something. What was going on? Marisol told him. There was a silence on the line that lasted a long time. Then he said, "I'm coming," and hung up. He arrived at St. Michael's at 1:17 a.m. His hair was disheveled. He was wearing a dress shirt that had been buttoned wrong in his hurry. He smelled like the inside of a hotel room, that particular recycled air smell, and underneath it, very faintly, something floral that wasn't Marisol's perfume. She noticed all of this in the flat, hyper-observant way that grief sometimes sharpens the senses before it dulls them. She noticed it and filed it away in a place she couldn't yet afford to look at. She let him hold her. She didn't hold him back. Her father arrived 40 minutes later. He'd driven down from Barrie in under 2 hours, which meant he'd been doing over 140 on the 400, which was exactly the kind of thing Alistair would do and never mention. He walked into the waiting room in his coat and his old boots, and he looked at his daughter and opened his arms, and Marisol walked into them, and finally started to cry. Over Marisol's shoulder, Alistair looked at Devereaux Crane. Devereaux was sitting in a plastic chair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He wasn't looking at Alistair. He was performing grief, though Alistair had spent 3 decades watching people perform things for him, and he knew the difference between the real thing and its imitation. He didn't say anything. Not that night. In the weeks that followed, the surface of things held. There was a funeral. Small, heartbreaking, a white casket no bigger than a hope chest. There was a condolence parade of colleagues and neighbors and people Marisol hadn't spoken to since university. There was a bereavement leave and a casserole from the neighbors, and a therapist Marisol started seeing on Thursday afternoons. Devereaux was present in the physical sense. He came home most nights. He answered questions when asked. He sat beside Marisol at the funeral and held her hand during the service and said the right things to the right people. He was, in every visible way, a grieving husband. But Marisol had started listening differently. It had started the night at the hospital. The smell, the wrongly buttoned shirt, the hour and a quarter it had taken him to arrive from wherever he'd been. She hadn't been in any state to think about it clearly that night, but the details had settled somewhere inside her, like sediment, waiting. She started paying attention to small things. The phone, always face down now on the kitchen counter. Late evenings that ran longer than they used to. A distance in his eyes when he looked at her that she'd been explaining away for months, as stress, as the pressures of his career, as things married people go through. She hadn't said a word to her father. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure of anything yet. But Alistair was already sure. He hadn't been a senior investigator with the RCMP for 22 years without developing a particular relationship with information. He knew how to find things quietly. He knew who to call. He had, in retirement, a network of former colleagues who still owed him favors and didn't ask many questions in return. He'd started making calls the morning after the funeral. It didn't take long. Devereaux wasn't careful because Devereaux had never had reason to believe anyone would look. The hotel in the distillery district, a boutique place, the kind that doesn't advertise but always has rooms available if you know how to book them, had records going back 11 months. A Tuesday evening reservation, every 2 to 3 weeks, consistent as a subscription. The name on the booking was always Devereaux's. The card used was a personal credit card that didn't appear on the joint account Marisol had access to. Alistair had a contact at the university too, an administrative coordinator who had worked there long enough to know everything that happened in the faculty of law, without anyone thinking to guard their words around her. She confirmed, carefully and without being unkind, that Devereaux and the visiting lecturer had been the subject of department gossip for the better part of a year. On the night Piper died, Devereaux had been at the hotel. Alistair sat with this information for 3 days before he told Marisol. He drove down on a Wednesday afternoon, let himself in with the spare key she'd given him years ago, and made tea in her kitchen while she came home from her therapist. He'd chosen the timing deliberately. She'd be steadier after a session than before one. He'd learned that from watching her. He put the mug in front of her and sat down across the table and told her what he'd found. He laid it out quietly, in the same voice he'd used for 30 years when he had to deliver facts that were going to hurt. He didn't editorialize, he let the information speak. Marisol listened without moving. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table for a long moment. Then she said, "I already knew. I just didn't know I knew." Alistair reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He said, "What do you want to do?" She looked up at him and there was something in her face that he recognized. Not anger, not yet, something quieter and more deliberate than anger. Something that had been building since 11:47 p.m. at St. Michael's Hospital and was now finally ready to be used. She said, "I want everything." What happened over the following 4 months was methodical and quiet and devastating, which was Alistair's preferred approach to most things. Marisol had retained a family lawyer, a woman named Frances Osei, sharp and unhurried, who had handled high-conflict matrimonial cases in the GTA for 18 years, and whose reputation Alistair had researched before recommending her. Frances listened to everything, reviewed everything Alistair had compiled, and then she got to work. The divorce filing cited adultery, with documentation. Hotel records, time-stamped booking confirmations, a deposition from one of Devereaux's departmental colleagues who, when faced with the formal process, had declined to lie on his behalf. The financial discovery was where it got ugly, which Frances had predicted. Devereaux had been maintaining that personal credit card, the one not on the joint account, for nearly 2 years. There were charges on it that went well beyond hotel rooms. Weekend trips that Marisol hadn't known about. Gifts, dinners, the kind of expenditures that, in aggregate, represented a meaningful portion of money from a joint savings account that had been quietly, incrementally drained. Alistair had also, through a contact in financial investigations who owed him a favor from a 2009 case, flagged something else, an ongoing pattern of invoice irregularities through the university's faculty research fund. Small amounts, nothing that would have tripped a routine audit, but consistent and clearly intentional. He'd passed that information to the appropriate channel without telling Marisol, because he believed in keeping things clean. Let the institutions do their work. His job was to make sure the information existed in the right hands. The university launched an internal review in October. By November, Devereaux was on administrative leave pending investigation. Courtney, for her part, had resigned her visiting position 2 weeks after Marisol filed, apparently having concluded that the Professionals Association was no longer advantageous. She left without issuing any statement and, as far as anyone could tell, without looking back. That part mattered to Marisol. She hadn't expected it to. She'd spent so much of her anger on Devereaux that she hadn't had a clear view of what she felt about Courtney. But knowing that the woman who had been in a hotel room 40 minutes away while Piper was dying had simply walked away, inconvenienced but otherwise intact, that landed differently. Marisol mentioned it once to Frances, and Frances said she understood, and made a note. Frances had already filed a civil claim that named Courtney as a co-respondent, rare, but not without precedent in Ontario in cases involving documented financial harm. It wouldn't produce the kind of reckoning that Marisol was looking for in the place where she felt it most, but it would produce consequences. Real ones. The kind that show up in professional records and insurance filings and background checks for the next decade. Nobody gets to walk away clean, Alistair had said to Marisol one evening in her kitchen, quietly, almost to himself. He was right. Courtney's legal fees alone would take years to resolve. Her professional references from the university were, thanks to the timing of her departure and the pending proceedings, effectively worthless. She would rebuild eventually. People like that always do. But she would rebuild from a much lower floor than the one she'd been standing on. The family court process was slower. These things always are. There were motions and counter-motions, and a mediation session that Devereaux entered with a posture of injured reasonableness that Marisol had once found attractive, and now recognized for exactly what it was. He was still performing. He was performing contrition this time, which was a new role for him, and he wasn't particularly good at it. The judge presiding over the matrimonial file was a man named the Honorable Judge Beaumont, who had a reputation in the family law bar for being uninterested in theatrics and extremely interested in documentation. He reviewed the financial disclosures without visible emotion. He noted, in the written decision, the timeline of the evening Piper died. He noted that Devereaux had been reachable and had chosen not to be reached. He noted the amount of money that had been diverted from joint marital assets over the 23 months of the affair. He awarded Marisol the matrimonial home, full custody of any decisions relating to Piper's estate and memorial arrangements, and a financial settlement that represented, in Frances's words, one of the more complete outcomes she had seen in a case of this kind. The criminal matter, which had been proceeding separately and which Marisol had largely stayed away from, at her father's suggestion, concluded in early spring. The university fraud investigation had been referred to the OPP. Devereaux had retained a criminal defense lawyer, and had, after several months of negotiation, entered a guilty plea to one count of fraud under $5,000. A resolution that his lawyer had presumably presented as a victory, which suggested his lawyer had a flexible definition of the word. The plea carried a fine, community service, and a notation on his record that would follow him through any future regulatory application in the legal profession. The Law Society of Ontario opened its own conduct review the following week. Marisol didn't end any of those proceedings. She'd been told she didn't have to, and she chose not to. She had started going back to work part-time in January, seeing clients 2 days a week, easing back in the way that Frances and her therapist and her father had all, in their different ways, suggested. She found that the work helped. She was good at sitting with people in difficult things. She had more fluency in that now than she'd ever had before, which was a terrible way to acquire a skill but was also, in some way she was still working through, not nothing. On a Saturday in late April, Alistair drove down from Barrie and took Marisol to the waterfront. They walked along the lake path from Harbourfront, west toward Humber Bay, the way they used to when she was small and he had 2 days off and they'd make a day of it. Breakfast somewhere, then the water, then whatever else came up. The weather had finally turned. There were families with strollers, a man playing guitar badly near the parking lot, a pair of geese making their opinions known from the shoreline. They didn't talk about any of it for a long time. They walked and watched the water and bought coffee from a cart near the bathrooms and kept walking. Eventually Alistair said, "How are you doing, honestly?" Marisol thought about it the way she'd learned to think about things, not rushing toward an answer, letting the real one surface. "I'm not okay," she said, "but I'm not disappearing either. I think those are different things." He nodded like she'd said something that made sense, which was one of the things she'd always loved about him. "Piper would have been 3 in February," she said after a while. "I know," he said. "I drove by that park on Lakeshore on my way down, the one she liked, with the duck sculptures." "Yeah." They walked a little further. A cyclist passed them on the left. "I keep thinking about what she would have been like," Marisol said. "She had this way of looking at you when she was thinking something over, very serious, like she was taking notes." "She got that from you," Alistair said. "I think she did," Marisol said, and for the first time in a long time she said it without the word catching in her throat. No judgment brought Piper back. No financial settlement, no guilty plea, no Law Society review. Marisol understood that in her bones, understood it in the way that grief eventually teaches you the true weight of things. What justice can do and what it cannot touch. It couldn't give her back the sound of her daughter's breathing in the dark, or the particular weight of a sleeping 2-year-old, or February mornings that would have been birthday mornings. But it could build a floor. It could draw a line. It could make the record say what actually happened, and who was responsible, and that those things had consequences in the world. Her father had done that for her. A quiet, methodical, thorough man who had spent 30 years in service of exactly that principle. That the truth has weight, and the weight can be made to fall where it belongs. Marisol tucked her arm through his as they turned back along the waterfront, the lake cold and gray-blue to their left, the city rising behind them, spring finally arriving the way it does in Toronto, reluctantly, imperfectly, but arriving. She held on.